Okay, so this is going to be a little bit of an introduction talking about ERP, the history of ERP platforms, and really where they came from. So, as we said, we talked a little bit in the course about the history of computing and, the how systems have moved from centralized mainframe processing to kind of our modern environment. But that did not happen overnight. All right, so there was once upon a time, and there were no such thing as an ERP systems, and as we've talked about, computer systems were tied to functional areas. So there was a computer system for production, a computer system for manufacturing, computer systems for HR. All right. So where did this idea? So it was, we see in modern applications this idea of an integrated platform, but where did this stuff come from? So there's a little bit of a history with this. All right. So as we said, our traditional applications were aligned really with the organizational structure. Organizational structure was everything. All right. Looking at your span of control and the way organizations, each department was operating. All right. And part and parcel of that was the computer systems were built, such that it optimized or, basically it built upon the fact that we had these separated functions. All right. So we had the HR application, which was basically only did stuff for the HR department. And the same thing was with sales, the same thing with purchasing, the same thing with accounting. So all these, this was all, the norm up through the early 90s. Right? So there's a couple drivers on this. So a couple things were happening at the end, end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. So one thing we have was, kind of the ongoing, um, you know, constant growth of computer capability, as we talked about with Moore's law. The systems get faster and faster, ongoing. But from a business perspective, there was a couple things that need to be considered as well. So one would be that we really had, organizations had reached a point where their efficiency um, was, organizations that were really straining to improve their performance, all right, and their efficiency. And what was happening was the current organization, it was an observation or, held um, thought that the organization itself, the structure, the way we did things, um, was actually an impediment. Right? So there was a driver, we were looking for some way of improving organizational efficiency. That's a starting point. All right. And then, from a academic perspective, there was a couple research, a couple different organizations, a couple different um, schools of thought that were really presented or brought forward around this time talking about this. So one is we talked a little bit about Dr. Hammer, Michael Hammer, and his what he called business process reengineering. There was also, we talked about with the value chain theory, which was Michael Porter. All right, and then finally we had a kind of a situation, a kind of a one-off situation with the end of the millennia, and a lot of these legacy applications, it was feared would not be able to operate, um, in the year 2000 because none of the programs were designed to calculate dates in the 2000s, or it was designed specifically around 20th century dates. So this was a really, and it was, it wasn't necessarily any one thing. It was really a combination of these forces kind of coming together. All right, which really kind of led to this idea of an ERP system. So as we said about the difference with Hammer, Michael Hammer, and his uh, thought process was, he really emphasized a kind of a violent restructuring. Or he would, a lot of his terms. If you read a lot of his papers and kind of his research, um, really what he said was, you could not do this stuff incrementally. You cannot incrementally modify an organization structure, you have to really tear it down and rebuild it from the ground up. So as we see here with one of his quotes from 1990, it cannot be planned meticulously and accomplished in a small and cautious steps. It's an all or nothing proposition with an uncertain result. And so you can imagine that this was sort of, in boardrooms was kind of looking at this a bit of a sconce because, most organizations tend to be fairly risk adverse. And coming into an organization looking to make a request for a strategic change in strategic direction for with an all or nothing proposition and an uncertain result. Usually, that's not the way most organizations would go. But what was happening was, though, that there was a growing recognition that things had to change. This became he was kind of at the one. I think Hammer was at like a one extreme. All right. The other research, the other big area that kind of influenced this was a gentleman by the name of Michael Porter, Dr. Porter from Harvard, who came up with this idea of what he called a value chain. So the value chain is this, as we look at the bottom here, what Porter said was you need to organize all of your key processes, what he called the primary activities of the organization, and it should be lined up so things flow, have a natural flow. With the idea is as you're going from step to step through the flow, you're increasing value. So what we call that, so that's why hence the term value chain. All right, because this is a chain. When you start with inbound logistics, you're bringing in raw material. As you go through your operations and manufacturing, you've transformed the material. It's now worth more, has a greater value. As we go through, ultimately, as we drive through, the value chain ultimately drives what the revenue stream is for the organization. All right, and then anything that's not part of a primary activity becomes what Porter called a support activity. And support activities are, what you strive for with support activities is consolidation and standardization. So instead of having maybe 5 or 10 or 15 different human resource departments across an organization, you would consolidate that into one centralized HR department, or the same thing with purchasing, procurement, one central purchasing organization as opposed to having multiple distributed individual organizational purchasing departments. All right. So these were the two kind of drivers. So coming out of this was this idea of a solution is what we call an ERP system. Right. So the ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning. It's defined as the ability to deliver an integrated. So the key words we kind of highlighted these. An integrated suite of business applications. So I think the integration becomes the key part of that because that aligns both with what Hammer was talking about, and also what Porter was talking about in terms of the value chain. So both of these really kind of focus on this idea of an integrated flow. So share common processes, data model, broad and end-to-end processes. So the thing we hear more and more of, and Roy was one of the things that drove kind of is part of parcel of this adoption of an ERP system, is this adoption of a process view that organizations need to look at their processes of how things get done as opposed to optimizing points of their organization. All right, and that all organizations have basically will have points where they contribute into a process execution. All right, so order processing, distribution, manufacturing, human resources, accounting, all play a role in their roles all, and they each one is integrated. It operates as an integrated whole. Right, so the idea is with these systems we automate and support a whole range of different operational administrative systems. Big, complicated. You're really turning your organization, say, inside out. One of the things that was interesting was when at the outset, there really was not, I think, a clear understanding of some of the implications of moving into this direction. All right, so what was found after you started going into it, that this stuff is not easy to do. That these projects, that at one level, I think there was a thought. It was like, well, it's like kind of like a traditional computer system, and as it was lying for a department. But this is really much more around business process, business structure, restructuring. So it was complex and expensive, and it was one of the challenges early on was trying to identify what were the benefits in moving in this direction. All right, but that was something that most organizations discovered that in changing their organization and kind of trying to keep the organization running while rebuilding it structurally, around this whole idea of integrated applications and integrated processes. It's a tall order, right? But but it is possible, and it does get and once you get through that and can start shifting your focus to a process oriented perspective on things, there are benefits that there are clear benefits to be derived from that. All right, so this is just a quick picture of what the SAP system, a lot of the modules that are in it. So you see these individual pieces. If you look at an organization, you'll see these are all the things that an organization does. So you have people who are involved with finance, and people who are involved with treasury, and people who are involved with quality management and plant management or plant maintenance, materials management. So all of these things, these are all of the different pieces that an organization, departments that organizations have. And this system, in this case, talking about the SAP system has all of these modules, and they are all built and they're all integrated together. So, and then, as we'd said, this idea of an integrated business process, these applications, were really built around this idea of changing your organization and thinking in terms of processes as opposed to departments. So, each organization, all these different departments on the value chain model, everything that lines up, for example, from your order to cash process, which is your sales process. Different departments are involved with that. So you have obviously your field sales organization, integrating with or customer facing, the order taking process, which then translates to the creation of deliveries and the logistics side of things, and then finally at the end picking up with the financial pieces, basically your accounts receivable and cash application. All right, so these end-to-end processes, and these are just examples of some of the core processes you'll see in companies now. So order to cash, procure to pay, those are the two major ones. But then concept to product, which is how you manufacture or design product design, marketing the customer, hire to retire, which is your human resources, demand to supply, demand planning, and supply chain planning. So all of these are, describe a whole series of steps. And what will happen is, as you look at these processes, each one of these boxes actually breaks into other stuff, into other pieces and other processes. All right. So what you've got is, if you can imagine, it's like Russian nesting dolls, where you've got, you have one overall doll, then you open it up, and there's other smaller dolls on the inside. All right, so these processes ultimately we, as you keep decomposing this stuff, ultimately you get down to the task. Basically, of somebody actually doing something at the end. All right. All right. So this is a high-level picture of the SAP order to cash process. This is what we're doing our lab exercise on. We have our pre-sales activity here. Call, inquiry, quotation. Somebody outside the org. This is from the customer side. Trying to evaluate whether to make a purchase, what to purchase, how much to purchase. That ultimately gets folded into the sales order process, all right, which is, where um, someone or something will get, collect an order or accept an order describing what the customer wants. Once we create the order, we then move it into the what we call the order fulfillment processes, which are around the delivery and things like material handling in warehouses. Right? And, so the idea is when you create a product, you take a sales order for different materials. Each of those materials ultimately have to be delivered to the customer. Ultimately, there is as part of this, we also are concerned about the goods issue, which where the product will actually transfer from our ownership, for the company, our ownership to the customer's ownership, and then the creation of an accounts um, receivable, for from the customer side, and then the generation of an invoice. And ultimately, as we said, ultimately what ends up happening is we end up exchanging material. We transform our material um, into cash. Right? So that's really what the order to cash process does. And this is the exercise, the high level view of the exercise we're going to be doing with SAP.